Hi, everyone. I'm Emma Perez. I'm here from University of Arizona, but I also like to tell people this is my alma mater. I grew up here, while at UCLA, BA, Master's, and PhD in history. And I am honored to be the moderator of this panel on digital gesturing, which is actually a really good title. And let me introduce our speakers in the order in which they're here, that they're presenting, okay? Israel Dominguez goes by he, him, his, and he's a PhD student in the Department of Religious Studies at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, holds a BA in Religious Studies from UT Austin, MA in Religious Studies from University of Colorado Boulder, where I had an opportunity to work with him, and he was in one of my grad classes, and it was a pleasure. A queer Tejano, I'm also a queer Tejano, born and raised in Rio Grande Valley. Gloria Anzaldua's work has always highly resonated with him and inspired his current research on curanderismo of the US-Mexico border and its intersections with decoloniality, disability theory, and queer theory. And to his right is Rebecca Avalos, who goes by she, her, and hers. Rebecca Avalos is a doctoral candidate of rhetoric and culture from the Department of Communication Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I've also had the pleasure of working with her closely. In fact, I'm on her DIS committee, and her work is really, both of them. Because they're my students, so of course I'm going to say that. Rebecca holds a doctoral certification in comparative ethnic studies from University of Colorado Boulder, a master's degree in comm studies, and a double major bachelor's degree in Chicana, Chicano, Latina, Latino studies and communication studies. Rebecca's a native queer mujer of color from the cultural borderland space of East LA, so this is home for her. Currently, Rebecca's research focuses on race, social movements, critical race theory, Chicanx studies, and queer theory as it relates to her dissertation subject, Donald J. Trump's Make America Great Again project. And to Rebecca's right, we have Tyler Quick, who I just had the pleasure of meeting earlier today. He is, Tyler's also goes by he, him, his. Tyler's a second-year PhD student at the Annenberg School for Communication at USC. His work is primarily concerned with the creation of affective publics through activism, art, and literature. He uses qualitative methods to understand how art and discourse produce what Raymond Williams referred to as structures of feeling. Current projects he's working on are concerned with as diverse topics as public homoeroticism, vaporwave, and radical left-wing activism. And so we will go in the order in which they are in the catalog. Okay. Thank you all for being here, by the way. Israel?
That's right.
There you go. Yes, you may.
What? Is it me? Oh, yeah.
Wait a minute. Yeah, it's him. Yes.
I've got the mic. Yeah.
Israel, Tyler, and then Rebecca.
Yeah.
And then we have time. So everyone's going to speak for about 15 minutes, right?
Right.
Or 20. I think it's 20.
I'll talk fast.
No, you don't have to talk fast. 20, Alicia?
You can do 20.
Yeah, 20 because there's three of you, and then we'll do Q&A. So go ahead if you have 20.
Sure. Is this okay? All right. Good afternoon. I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we meet is the occupied, unceded land of the Chumash and Tongva peoples. I spent most of this past summer working as an overnight stocking clerk at a large grocery chain in the town where I currently live, Carborough, North Carolina. It was meditative to clock in, listen to podcasts while I stocked shelves, and then clock out and leave work at work. One night, as I was stocking the juice, soda, water aisle, I noticed a new kind of LaCroix flavor. LaCroix, as I'm sure many of you are aware, has quickly become the lifeblood of the Academy. I sometimes think I should request travel funding from their company since they feature so prominently at almost every university event. Not this one.
Not this one.
The flavor combination and bright packaging drew my attention, and then I noticed the name of this particular line of naturally essenced flavors, Curate. I instantly zeroed in on the blurb. Centuries ago, in a romantic land far away, a young prince formulated an exotic potion for his betrothed. It became known as QGrad. From then on, his empire was forever blessed, for QGrad means cure me. Try it for yourself, there's nothing else like it. As I'm sure you can imagine, a bevy of questions and comments fluttered through my mind. Exoticism, centuries ago, romantic land, exotic potion. So of course there's this leaning on language of mysticism in far-off lands. Classist, gatekeeping, prince, betrothed, empire. Health apparently is by the rich, for the rich. An exclusionist eternal claim, there's nothing else like it, and his land was forever blessed. So outside epistemologies are rendered useless or inaccessible. And then mistranslation. Is the Spanish wrong? Am I the one that is wrong? It was that last bit which gave me the most pause, and it had me second-guessing my linguistic capabilities. I remember as a child imploring my curandera mother to curame, ama, curame, cure me, mom, cure me, because I was fascinated by the egg ritual meant to counteract mal de ojo. And so once my eyes and brain connected, I realized it was indeed LaCroix which had mistranslated a simple Spanish word off by one letter. Curate does not mean the plaintive heal me, rather it is a directive, heal yourself. The difference that one letter made was enough to make me think about healing in the United States in the present day. We live in a society where the onus is always already on us to heal ourselves, even to the point of mass-marketed mistranslation. Try it, cure yourself, do it now. This pressure to fix oneself immediately and on one's own elides the importance of community and interpersonal relationships to different frameworks of healing. These are the questions and realizations that informed this particular paper. So for those who are unfamiliar, curanderismo, in the way that I will be talking about it at least, is a Mexican-American magical religious tradition composed of a blend of indigenous, Native American, and Christian practices. It employs natural tools like herbs and eggs and water to bring equilibrium and healing to the minds and bodies of the ailing. Derived from the Spanish root word curar, meaning to heal, practitioners are called curanderos, or healers, and largely these healers are categorized into three distinct but overlapping classifications: hierberos, or herbalists; parteras, or midwives; and sobadores, or masseurs. Hierberos deal primarily with herbs and plants. Midwives are distinguished for their knowledge of the female reproductive system, for ensuring as safe a delivery for the baby as possible, and for caring for the mother after she gives birth. Sobadores will massage muscles, and many are well-versed in the setting of broken bones and dislocated joints. While curanderismo very obviously addresses physical ailments, it is also concerned with spiritual distress. Religious studies scholar Gaston Espinosa claims that for many Latin Americans, there are no such things as bad accidents or good luck. Everything is shaped by the supernatural world, for good or ill. And this conviction is prevalent throughout curanderismo or folk healing. No stranger to the workings of curanderismo, Gloria Anzaldúa was a queer Latina theorist, activist, poet, and author, born and raised in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas. She is most notably known for her works on Chicana feminist and queer theories, and her book Borderlands, La Frontera, the New Mestiza uses highly evocative, sensual poetry and prose to grapple with decolonizing, particularly by empowering indigenous people and addressing alternative sexualities. She stresses the importance of actively using one's indigeneity to their advantage, not as something to be ashamed of, but as something from which to draw strength. Anzaldúa introduces her theory of Nepantla in this book when she aims to empower a demographic that resides at the intersection of indigenous and alternatively gendered and or sexually oriented. Describing it as the in-between space between worlds, a space that simultaneously exists and does not exist, Anzaldúa explains, Nepantla is the site of transformation, the place where different perspectives come into conflict and where you question the basic ideas, tenets, and identities inherited from your family, your education, and your different cultures. Nepantla is the zone between changes where you struggle to find equilibrium between the outer expression of change and your inner relationship to it. From the in-between place of Nepantla, you see through the fiction of the monoculture. Anzaldúa further illuminates this term in her posthumous work, Light in the Dark, and it continues to serve as the backbone for most of her ideology. Nepantla is the place where my cultural and personal codes clash, where I come up against the world's dictates, where these different worlds coalesce in my writing. Nepantla is the point of contact, el lugar between worlds, between imagination and physical existence, between ordinary and non-ordinary spirit realities. She eventually extends this tension to society as a whole and posits that it is through the consistent navigating of this in-between space, this liminality between cultural and social boundaries, that change can be effected. She claims, in Nepantla, we undergo the anguish of changing our perspectives and crossing a series of cruz calles, junctures, and thresholds, some leading to a different way of relating to people and surroundings, and others to the creation of a new world. Nepantlas are places of constant tension where the missing or absent pieces can be summoned back, where transformation and healing may be possible, where wholeness is just out of reach but seems attainable. As a product of multiple and disparate cultural traditions, I argue both that curanderismo operates within Nepantla and that the internet itself is a kind of Nepantla through which people can find transformation and healing. While curanderismo focuses on physical touch, like plants and herbs and oils applied to the skin directly, stories of remote healing are found linked to historically prominent healers. A prime example of this would be found in the life of Don Pedro Jaramillo, a curandero born in Mexico during the middle of the 19th century, but who worked primarily in South Texas for most of his life. His popularity kept increasing after his death to the point where his face can now be found on glass vigil candles in mainstream grocery stores throughout most of southern and central Texas. H-E-B, any fellow Texans? Yeah, you got it. There are many surviving anecdotes which detail his alleged ability to diagnose illnesses through mailed letters or based on sight alone, giving hope to those who had no trust in Western medicine or simply could not afford it. So it is no surprise to find a modern and digital presence surrounding curanderismo, from the University of New Mexico offering a seminar on its history to practitioners offering instructional classes and remedies online. Based out of San Antonio, Texas, Concha Ruiz's website, curiouscurandera.com, has been online for over a decade. Her mission statement says, "This site is designed to provide spiritual guidance and tools for anyone on a spiritual quest, or simply to help those that have need of my assistance." On this website, she claims, quote, "You will find lots of free and paid articles and ebooks on various subjects such as working with ancestors, spirit guides, prayers, blessings, tarot, spiritual baths and cleansings, saints, psychic development, and a lot more. You'll find lots of interesting online courses designed to teach you the skills for spiritual work, such as a spiritual cleansing course, a saint magic and folk magic course, and reading the Spanish cards for divination." She also says, "The services I offer to the public include spell work, trabajos, rituals, card reading, energy clearing, spiritual consultations, and spiritual cleansing of the home." Another self-proclaimed curandera, Erica Buenaflor of realizeyourbliss.com, has a prolific social media presence. She can be found on Twitter and Instagram, offering tips to the public for free. Roses always enhance the power of any magic. Place a rose or roses on your altar to strengthen the intention and work your magic. For most kinds of kidney or intestinal problems, drink a tea of spearmint, rue, and parsley every day for at least 30 days. Parsley, for example, prevents absorption of salt in the tissues, thereby preventing the formation of kidney stones. Or learn water limpias for the mind, body, and soul, only $5. If you search for hashtag curanderismo on Twitter, or Instagram, you'll find an abundant of instances of Latinx people trying to connect or reconnect with the heritage obfuscated for them by settler colonialism. Tumblr user Grim Grinning Danny writes, "Witches of color, where you at? Looking for X's, black, brown witches, anything not. I would like to explore witchcraft beyond Eurocentric magic. Anyways, looking for more witches of color." Tumblr user Barbara Rich links curanderismo to brujeria and says, "If you actively pursue a deeper connection to your people and history, even though you weren't born there, you can be a brujo. It is an act, a rebellion, a reclamation of our history when you do so, so be mindful of that." These decolonial approaches to the transmission of knowledge, using social media, offering information to the masses for free, actively reclaiming indigeneity, are all elements that can provide healing to individuals and communities at large. In 2009, anthropologist Antonio Zavaleta published Curandero Conversations, a work that examined 190 email-based consultations with a curandero from South Texas named Alberto Salinas. People were asked to submit emails to Salinas asking for advice, and then he would respond with remedies, and then a commentary by Zavaleta would follow. Over 7,000 emails were received. Salinas identifies as a fidencista, a follower of Niño Fidencio who also attends services organized by the Iglesia Fidencista, or the Church of Niño Fidencio. As such, Salinas' advice is geared toward those who are inspired by and seek out the advice of the deceased spirit of Niño Fidencio. Fidencistas sponsor annual celebrations in honor of their namesake twice a year in Espinazo, a town in Mexico with a population of around 400 that hosts up to 40,000 tourists during festivals. A bit about Niño Fidencio. Born José de Jesús Fidencio Constantino Cintora, he was a curandero especially noted for his gentle demeanor, his soft voice, and his restraint from sexual activity. So much so, in fact, that he is mostly widely known by the epithet niño, or boy. Fidencio's blurring of the gender binary, which normally would have drawn consternation in a culture that exalts hegemonic masculinity, endeared him to his followers. The following excerpt is one email consultation collected in Curandero Conversations in a section titled El Niño on the Internet, La Red Espiritual, or the Spiritual Network. These are the words of the petitioner. Today, I finally know that the spirit of the Niño Fidencio really exists. The truth is that my father is very ill, and the doctors have already told him there is no cure for him. He suffers from diabetic neuropathy. His nerves are shot, and the diagnosis given by the doctors has no remedy. Through the internet, I have come to know the Niño Fidencio, and also to know you are his instrument that can heal persons. I would like for you to help my father and entrust all my heart to the Niño. Is there something my father can take, since it is practically impossible for him to move around? Could you orient me to where the nearest Niño Fidencio healer is located? Because I would like to visit a healing mission as soon as possible. I am grateful for your attention, and in advance am very thankful to God and the Niño Fidencito. I have faith my father will be healed. This is the first half of the curandero's response. I am glad that you have become aware of Niño Fidencio. It could be that because of your faith and that of your father, through the Niño's meditation, God will grant your father a miracle. It has happened before. Thank God for giving us the healing internet. And this is the scholar's commentary. Today, young Latinos look to curanderismo for assistance with their problems more than ever before. This is primarily due to the fact that the healthcare system does not provide for their cultural needs. This person writes that he is fearful about his father's health, but the healthcare system has written the father's life off. The fact that healthcare is difficult to access, combined with feelings of desperation and isolation, provokes persons to seek alternative healthcare modalities. Love for one's parents and concern for their well-being enables them to contact curanderos for assistance. At the point that this family finds itself, faith and church and curanderismo are the only healthcare alternatives available to them. It is significant and gratifying that this computer-literate petitioner has come to the Niño Fidencio via the internet. So, at the end of the day, what can we take away from this compilation of information? This paper has very briefly compared historical accounts of remote healing with modern anecdotes gleaned from instances with active practitioners, while aiming to explore and theorize how the digital world acts as a kind of nepantla that offers healing and hope to the ailing and differently abled. It is easy for the more conservative of us to dismiss the effects of online interactions, but this attitude disregards the effusion of affect and elides the nuances that comprise human connection. The internet, and especially decolonizing curanderismo on and through the internet, can provide useful generative avenues for healing colonial wounds. Our investigation into how this works forces us to grapple with non-colonial ideas of space, location, and interaction. And here I'm gesturing toward what religious studies scholar Aisha Velizo de Jesus calls co-presences, electrifying currents that are sensed with the physical body and seemingly transmitted through media and screens, even to the point where a practitioner, a santero in her case, may end up being possessed by their patron Oricha just by watching a video clip of a particular ritual. Perhaps it is these co-presences which occupy and animate the realm of Nepantla. Further, it would be productive to investigate how online framings and portrayals of curanderismo, hashtags on Twitter, images on Instagram, for example, influence the kind of people who approach this praxis and decide to engage deeply or on a deeper level. Does framing the healing and the medicine differently, in turn, affect the cure? The use of the internet, advertising online, promoting cultural spread, serves to enable a negotiation of identities. And here I gesture specifically toward Chela Sandoval and the idea of differential identity and consciousness. Is this navigation of identities a type of medicine, a type of healing? What is at stake when conflating curanderismo with New Age, with shamanism? Does this perhaps serve as witness to curanderismo's malleability or fluidity? Or does it do a disservice to traditions that are so sedimented with indigenous American knowledge? Lastly, I would also like to acknowledge the issue of internet accessibility and computer literacy, which, while seemingly globally widespread, are still out of reach for many along the US-Mexico border, especially those in South Texas, which is largely considered one of the poorest areas of the nation. In Crip theory, Robert McCruer writes that able-bodiedness, even more than heterosexuality, still largely masquerades as a non-identity, as the natural order of things. Perhaps if we take seriously the internet as a place for wholesome positive change, we can undermine the centrality of able-bodiedness and heterosexuality as default settings of human existence and allow room for holistic kinds of healing and different ways of being. Thank you.
We'll hold questions to the end. And so next, Tyler.
While I'm setting, oh, Jesus, okay. While I'm setting this up, I just want to say that if you, like me, suffer with body image issues or anorexia, there are going to be some images that might be upsetting, and I'm going to talk about something that's pretty upsetting for me, so you might want to get out of here and I won't be offended. Let's start with a personal anecdote. Word. Sequestered away in suburbia, with no way to get into bars yet, long before Grindr, I had contact with only a handful of potential gay role models, one of whom was named Joey and was a MySpace famous teen living in Ohio that I was friends with. Unlike me, Joey seemed to be happy. At the time, I, friendless and sexually frustrated, attributed this to something that he had and that I did not, a homoerotic life. Joey had a boyfriend. He had pictures of himself that garnered dozens of comments from admiring men. People wanted to fuck him. He also had a habit of taking his shirt off the internet and doing other, like, sexy shit, and it gave me an idea. I would do the same. By emulating his strategies of self-presentation and social interaction, I too could learn how to be desirable, sexually active, and thus a part of a community that is, and I will argue today, at least in part, constituted around the shared practice of gay sex. His public homoeroticism became the template for the embodiment and performance of my own sexuality. Through imitating his behavior, I learned how to seduce guys on the internet, and eventually lose my virginity in a hilarious story that's probably even inappropriate for this conference, so I will save it for later. But feel free to ask me in the hallway. I also learned, unfortunately, how to be anorexic, which is a struggle that I still face today. And the paramount role of digital media in producing gay culture, and indeed gay people, has only increased since my childhood. For rural and suburban people, those still in the closet, and even people living in major metropolitan areas like Los Angeles who don't have access to their gay community, the internet serves as one of the only avenues of access to gay culture. And still, few scholars have focused their work on the arbiters and conveyors of homoeroticism on the internet, besides the scope of porn. And in his book, How to Be Gay, David Halperin, one of the preeminent theorists of gay culture and gay society, asserts that gay identity isn't even constituted by shared sexual practices. And I can tell you as a gay guy myself, that's not right. That's not true. And I'm going to explain how Instagram influencers can, and I hope you all know what that means, I'll explain it in a minute if you don't, can disprove Halperin's point. So, yeah, gross, right? I use the word influencer here to refer to young gay men with large Instagram followings who produce primarily homoerotic content. Take, for example, these assholes. I'm aware of how problematic this representation is, by the way, but it's an unfortunate reality. And gay Instagram, like much of mainstream gay culture, is rigidly body normative, white supremacist, and beholden to the self-destructive cults of masculinity, patriarchy, and heteronormativity. But because of the near total dearth of research into gay Instagram, I can't quantify for you how important these people are. Some of them have massive followings, including one man, I think this one with his boyfriend right there, over 1 million people, most of whom are gay men. I'm also one of those queens that can't do math, so I can't really quantify it anyway. But I do know that from the quantitative literature that there was a 2011 psychological experiment done in the Journal of Experimental Psychology that basically suggested that mimetic desire which I'm going to get into in a moment, is stronger for gazed at objects than it is for objects that are not being seen. So the fact that this influencer has 1 million followers means that he can redirect the gaze of all who notice his gaze towards objects, especially sexual objects. And this magnifies his power to influence gay sexual culture through his performance of being gay. And I can tell you that as I got further into this inquiry, that I cannot tell you how this problem of Instagram influencers and their influence in the community could not be overstated. We have to talk about my methodology, I guess. I interviewed 20 of these influencers for this project to understand why they did what they did. Then I distributed a questionnaire to their followers, and I followed up with these followers to continue the conversation. All the while, I spent inordinate amounts of time investigating the practices of gay Instagram. Some might call this digital ethnography. The latter word in that really makes me nervous. Regardless, through participant observation, covert discourse analysis, and interviewing, I gained an understanding as to how this whole process works. And it begins with the theory of René Girard, whose theory of mimetic desire compels us to understand the influencer as a necessary actor within a culture that demands personages to lust after so that homosexual and homosexually inclined men might realize the possibility of homoeroticism and the gay sex that it implies in their own lives, despite their often very heteronormative environments. In his book, Violence and the Sacred, Girard says that mimetic desire is rooted neither in the subject nor the object, but in a third party whose desire is imitated by the subject. Influencers are therefore not only their followers' object of desire, but subjects recognized as imitable, living blueprints for who to desire, how to desire, what to desire, and how to comport oneself to attain one's desires. The publication of an influencer's desire and publication of their enactments produces a public homoeroticism that affords their followers the opportunity to attach their own bewildering, confused desires to an object, which is to say, to enact a sexual existence of their own via mimesis. Here's an example. Many of the most popular influencers become popular not just because of sexualized content, but rather through the publication of their romantic relationships with, of course, some allusions to the possibility of gay sex. Of all the influencers I interviewed, many of them told me that they didn't even amass their large followings until they started posting pictures of themselves with their boyfriends online. One influencer, who's now single, said that he would receive hundreds of letters in a P.O. box each month from all over the world, places as far as Abu Dhabi and India, thanking him and his ex for showing his followers what a happy, healthy, normal relationship could look like. I also, as an aside, must say that this couple portrayed themselves as monogamous online, but were in a very open relationship privately and did the best they could to hide that, which is going to be one of the many contradictions that I point out today. And I actually interviewed one of his followers and asked him about the former relationship, and he said this. It was almost heartbreaking to me. And this is someone that lives in the rural United States. When they're cute together, it makes me really hopeful that I could have a relationship like that someday. However, the template provided by Instagram influencers to their public is a fiction, and one upon which real people predicate a sexual praxis that they feel is most adequate to attaining their actual desires and that is representative of their interior lives. My interviews have revealed the increasing awareness of influencers' use of appearance editing apps like Facetune have made Facetune more common among lay people. Many of my interviewees did more than just change their online appearance as well, while citing influencers as their inspiration to dye their hair, change their clothes, change the way they speak, and of course, go to the gym. This contributes to a culture of anorexia, which, by the way, René Girard's only book where he has an empirical object of study is actually called Anorexia and Mimetic Desire, and I think it should be a book that's taught more frequently in queer studies. But anyways, this culture of anorexia becomes an arms race, both on and offline, to see who can have the most unrealistic, hot-looking body, which is probably a factor in why gay men are almost 4 times more likely than straight men to have eating disorders. And that's, just off 4 studies off the top of my head that I could cite. This has been found repeatedly again and again and again. And on the other side of that, many of the influencers worry that their online personas actually impede their abilities offline to date and pursue romantic relationships. One interesting anecdote is an influencer who since has actually deleted his Instagram told me, "I know that I don't look like my pictures, but what really bothers me are the constant messages coming from followers who say when they meet me in person that I'm not, quote, masculine as they thought that I would be." There's a cultural prejudice against effete men in the gay community. This has been documented by tons of scholars like Brandon Miller at UMass Boston. And the masculinist assumptions applied to this influencer's pictures, or rather, by the outside, I actually lost a sentence there with this printing. That was weird. So we'll get by. Basically, Instagrammers have even admitted to me that they have intentionally masculinized their online imago using heteronormative tropes to gain followers. And Richard Dyer says this is because homoeroticism can be a generous and inclusive notion, but it also has a tendency to contain and desexualize. The attempt to embody this fictional and unrealistic idea of masculinity via mimesis can and does harm gay people and the gay community, both influencers and those that follow them. Another example, an influencer who I interviewed during a public breakup described the situation as, quote, a PR nightmare. One of his followers I interviewed told me that because this influencer couldn't make it work with his ex, this person, this gay teenager, was convinced that nobody would ever love again. The ex, quote, loved blank so much he would have done anything for him. What they had was perfect, so nothing will ever be perfect again. Knowing the full story about the relationship, I can tell you that it was never perfect, but the influencer received hundreds of hateful letters and messages anyway. Essentially, this project was intended originally to be a Girardian rebuttal to David Halperin's work in How to Be Gay. I don't know how many of you have read this book. Halperin locates the development of gay culture and sociality merely in relations to cultural objects. Joan Crawford, because what's more relevant to a very diverse queer set of millennials than Joan Crawford, right? We all learned to be gay through Joan Crawford, apparently. And he overlooks the shared experience of sex as constitutive of gay culture and gay identity as well. I believe it merits a closer look. Halperin himself says if gayness is a practice, it's something you can do well or badly, and that in order to do it well, you may need to be shown how to do it by someone else who is already good at it and who can initiate you into it. Listen, for many people who live in heteronormative environments, public homoeroticism is their first contact with the possibility that they could enact whatever their desires may be, homosexual or intangible. So I postulate that the influencer is the person that shows them this. The influencer is their initiator into erotic life. And this is for millions of queer people or, queer adjacent people. While I've been doing this project, it's really kind of taken a drag on me, and I no longer want to be affiliated with it at all, even though I'm giving an appeal for everyone to look more into this phenomenon. But it's actually conveniently enough landed me back at my main intellectual interest, which is how gay culture, and I mean mainstream gay culture, right? Like cis-normative, white, WeHo gay culture has been thoroughly neoliberalized. This conversation is not being had in academia, and I think that that's a real shame because many of the solutions that have been proposed have been through traditional media, especially the gay media, which has just not been great. I have here the logo of Toll Road, which is a mainstream gay blog who for years used to, at the end of their news roundup, have an Instagram influencer to follow. And spoiler alert, it was mostly very buff, cis, white guys. They've resolved it. Now they only have at the bottom of it men of color, but also very buff, cis, and conforming to masculinist ideals of sexuality. I don't think that nearly goes far enough. It's not politically radical at all. And they're starting to make a change in that, but it actually infuriates me what they've done. I can think off the top of my head 5 or 6 times where the man of color they featured was actually a guy from Spain, a white guy from Spain. And under the veneer of this liberality is the same old normative prescription for what happy and healthy gay sexuality looks like. The same unrealistic bodies to be emulated, the same ghosts of heteronormative relationships to be envied. And even more problematic is the encroachment of the gay porn industry on Instagram, which is becoming a source of anxiety and alienation in the community. And gay influencers' influence has increased manifold through the rise of websites like OnlyFans. And if none of you are familiar with that, I'm happy to talk about that during the questions time. And finally, I'm just straight up despondent by the more cynical turn towards aesthetically progressive politics. I won't read this to you, but this guy posted some diatribe about representation and the war in Syria and how he's a really good white person while still subliminally shoving this shit down everyone's throat, right? And another guy, I mean, like, ask me about the France story later as well, because like that's even more infuriating. Someone painted like a pro-equality symbol on their bare chest to like protest against like, I think it was homophobia in France. And I was like, why did you have to be shirtless to do this? So I don't have too much time left, but I just want to say this has not been a fun topic to research. It may seem trite to some of you, but it's important, because every night when I walk to Ralph's, stoned at midnight to buy some bananas for the next day, I go through Santa Monica Boulevard, past dozens and hundreds of WeHovians, which is the correct term for people from WeHo, just so you know, who value this kind of shit. And it's important to them. And Instagram is how they construct their sexual identity, their sexual selfhood, and our culture. And it's incumbent upon us, and by us here I mean especially white, gay, cis men who have access to these communities, to rigorously investigate the foundations of this culture so that one day we may be able to save a community that is obviously an ethical crisis. And with that, thank you so much.
All right. Hola a todos. The title of my work is Leaving the Quotidian Through Digital Habitus, Disidentification and Gestures of Intimacy. The contemporary Trumpian political ecology is nothing short of colonial terrorism. However, where there is power, there is resistance, Foucault. It is in recognizing the possibility and empowerment of the digital realm that this work explores how to fissure and leave, even if temporarily and imaginative, the ecology of affective American terrorism. Resistance occurs through the digital disidentification, Muñoz, and in the finding of space where queer intimacy is possible, Rodriguez. Specifically, this project centers the Latinx queer sites of Remezcla and We Are Me Too. At heart, this project centers how the digital realm serves as a site that enables queer rhetorical practice that both acknowledges the frequently suppressed nature of much social interaction and in doing so allows for alternative, non-normative readings. As argued in the work of queer of color theorist Rodriguez, gestures, and for the purpose of this project, digital gestures, function as new modes of survivability, of intimacy and connection as they are needed for the soothing of one's primary resistance, one's humanness, and one's communionship with others. Further, it is these modes of digital disidentification that allow for a shifting onto another then and there, another world of luz and light. This project explores this very process of navigation, a departure of the looping systems of quotidian life, a process and shifting to disidentify and to find and then and there, where human touch and intimacy is possible. Introduction. The affect of terror is not contained to a fixed location or materialized place. Terror seeps, spills, flows, and is in excess, viscerally everywhere, visibly nowhere. The contemporary Trumpian political ecology is nothing short of terrorism, and yet for the mind of those who occupy bodies contemporarily and historically marked less than as subhuman, non-human, or abhuman, where does one go when terror does not leave, but rather saturates public and semi-private life? How does one soothe an aching caused from a fire that burns from the outside in? The productions of terror move beyond their legal, material, and discursive articulations as cultural politics of emotion, Ahmed. Viscerally felt, flowing and moving, the circulations of the affect of terror mark on the body and mind. And at its very root, American affective terrorism does not begin in the psyche of one individual experience of anxiety, but rather a political and affective articulation induced on bodies by the very markings of an ecological system of American ongoing colonialism for bodies within and outside its borders. For the affective ecology of American terrorism, in all its network flows of discursive hatred and architectural webbings of xenophobia, transphobia, capitalism, racism, and colonial legal policies, they construct the conditions and dominant possibilities of life. An affective function of the current Trump administration remains, that is, in post-9/11 America, the desire to continue to terrorize the body of the other continues, to shrink the other's possibility of existence persist. It is sensical and structural why one simply cannot sleep and why one remains so very awake, so very woke in one's state of consciousness. The question, however, remains, where does a subject go when terror does not leave the mind? Guided by a discourse analysis and a discourse methodological framework, this project explores the departure of such economy of affective American terrorism through digital disidentification and digital gestures of new socialities of intimacy found in the Chusmeria, Munoz, the structure of feeling, Williams, the brown sensing and brown feeling, Munoz, found in the media sites of Remezcla and We Are Me Too. As the circuits and circulations of dominant American life force one to bear witness with such proximity and brutal intimacy, the cycling of the latest Trump administration fragment of hatred, the performativity of violence folds onto one's mind, and the mind then fuses onto the affective cultural politics of emotion, Ahmed. The quotidian news cycle and barbaric reality of American life force one to witness again and again the colorless nature of steel, the moisture found in the zoomed-in tears of a migrant mother, the reverberating sounds of crying migrant asylum-seeking children. How does one leave, even if only in psychic form, and fleeing in time the entanglement of affective terrorism that composes the American everyday life? As argued in the work of Rodriguez, gestures, and for the purpose of this project, digital gestures, function as radical, ephemeral modes of survivability, of intimacy and connection, and being in communion with others. Further, it is in and through these modes of digital disidentification, in being with and sharing space, in sites remixed, remezcla, and in being among strangers in sites where audiences come together and come apart, composing a fluid and different base where everyone can be included, Me Too. Me Too includes and sustains a space of difference, a space that is resignified, a space that resignifies. Moving and shifting, gesturing towards another then and there, Remezcla and Me Too remain sites constructed by disidentification enactments themselves as they radically break from the normative craft to discourse space, and they craft a discursive space for Latinidad and the politics of difference. While Munoz has argued eloquently that disidentification is just one of the many available tactics of survival, counterpublics constituted through disidentificatory acts create places and spaces for survivability and further act as spaces that construct a home of private scripts. Beyond the theoretical formations just stated, the habitus of survival allows for intimacy, connection, and touch as imaginative possibilities within just a hand's digital reach. It is this then an escape to another place where one can belong as is that marks such significance of both of these sites. At heart, this work grounds queer of color critique and phenomenology. As digital materializations of brown commons, Munoz, Remezcla and Me Too embody an affect of feeling brown, Munoz. These affective differences are the ways in which differently historically coherent groups feel differently and navigate the material world on a different emotional register, Munoz. In the piece Feeling Brown, Munoz discusses the notion of racial performativity as a form of political doing based on the recognitions of the effects of race. Thus, feeling brown is a modality of recognizing the affective particularities coded to specific historical subjects. Munoz emphasizes feeling brown is not an individual's sentiment, but rather a collective mapping of self and others under particular political conditions. The shared understanding of political experience is a structured feeling. With this work and building off of Raymond Williams' structure of feeling, Munoz shifts from a purview of identity to affect and centers the affective site where race is experienced commonly, this brown commons. Speaking to the conditions of survivability, taste and brown feeling, Remezcla and Me Too continuously report on within intentionally interwoven threads of high and low culture, of elite and dominant mainstream and underground subversive news threads and taste. These news center both what is dominated in the center as well as what's can be found peripheral and in the margins. And all of the in-between chisme and chismera that functions as a thread of culture. Some constituting titles of these two sites are the best 12 Latino hot sauces you need right now, the top 12 Latin American studies programs you need to know, everything you need to know about the migrant caravan that is heading towards the US-Mexico border, on why young Latinos are cynical about voting, and more from comprehensive study of Latino voters, and to the viral underground favorite of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs dancing to a Thou Thou. It is a mixture of political play from within and play of the political from the outside. The radical shifting of disidentification found in both sites of Remezcla and Me Too is found in their intentional remixing of genres and aesthetics of dominant news reporting and dominant mainstream whiteness and heterosexual assumed digital sites. These sites, Remezcla and Me Too, are not solely placing high and lowbrow political currents and cosas of cultura together, but in it they are in the in-betweenness of how they report, they are mixing the genres, mixing the aesthetics, mixing the taste. And in doing so, they are centering what Munoz describes as churrusmera, that is the unapologetic racial excess of it all, the affect of racialness, of queerness, of otherness that is not contained, that is not apologetic, that is going to cross borders and is going to be centered. For Munoz, chusmera is a form of behavior that refuses the bourgeois compartment and suggests Latinos should not be too black, too poor, or too sexual, among other characteristics that exceed a white hetero citizen normativity. As a materialization and iteration, chusmera is visible on both Remezcla and Me Too sites in the unapologetic centering of iconography, discourse, audio, mimetic images that center and celebrate racial excess and queerness and performance. In such representations of work, there are spills of being loud, of bold and capitalized text, of explanation points, of color combinations not dominant to mainstream media viewing. Further, for chusmera, in uncontained racial excess, it is also visible in the centering of the preferred taste, the recetas, the foods that you have to have, the hot sauces that you need, as well as in the centering of ordinary, but yet so iconic images of Latinidad, like, for example, elotes con chile. There are also articles reviewing and centering the latest sounds of Latinidad, the latest Afro-Latino reggaeton, and many other both highbrow, lowbrow, in-between remixed news. Both the Remezcla and Me Too center the uncontained, what has not been whitewashed, and they center this preference and sensibility, and in doing so, center expressions of cultural practice that no border, there is no consent or co-signing to survey or border whatever is being stated in its excess. Just as there is political dissemination of what materially affects Latinx counterpublics, the materializations of Latinx counterpublics are too represented and centered. So it's not just that these sites report on what is important and what is politically affecting our communities, but that our own art, our own culture is equally being centered. Our own products of our culture are also being centered and remixed just as they are without much editing or whitewashing for another white audience palette. Some examples of this can be the spiritual traditions of brujeria and tarot that are centered in these sites, to the tasted captured by recetas y comida tradicional that you should know, to the sounds of the best Afro-Latino reggaeton and cumbias, Remezcla and Me Too engage in disidentification and the political acts of archiving, of including, and remembering the in-betweenness of cultural life with chusmera and, of course, with chisme. It is in these remix sites of play and politics that brown commons, as Munoz stated, are themselves materialized through practices of disidentification and chusmera. At heart, both sites center the meaning and the production and materialize the brown commons in the very act that remixes, resignifies, and creates a disidentificatory third meaning. For Munoz, disidentification is about imagining and negotiating historical trauma and systemic violence. The disidentificatory subject does not assimilate, identify, nor reject, counter-identify dominant ideology. Rather, the disidentificatory subject employs a third strategy and tactically and simultaneously works on, with, and against a dominant cultural form. Disidentification is also a survival strategy. Through disidentification, the disidentifying subject is able to rework the dominant cultural codes of the mainstream to read themselves into the mainstream, a simultaneous insertion and subversion, a remezcla and a Me Too. The creation of such spaces of relationality disrupt social scripts and create through their work an opening of possibility for other visions of the world that map different social relations. Munoz suggests that such work is vital for queer people of color's survival and possibilities for imagining another world possible. Yet Remezcla and Me Too also contain the feeling of brown, the ephemeral sentimientos and beyond linguistic utterances of communications, as it's not just about the print, it's not just about what one reads or one sees, but about what one feels. Moreover, gestures like chusmera, for Rodriguez, gestures bring into being the possibility of a we with over-the-top gestures, our bodies betraying or gleefully luxuriating in our intentions to exceed the norms of proper civil dominant corporal containment. While not all of Remezcla and Me Too's work calls directly to the reader, much of the titled work does intentionally call out the reader and bring in the reader with linguistic calls of what you need to know, what you need to have, what you're missing out on. However, beyond these more visible invitations to connect, gestures of communication are themselves constituted through the ephemeral, the unseen but felt, brown feeling, Munoz, that is fostered in what is constituted, in the space that is created, the feeling of home that invites. Thus, acting as a third space for differential inclusion, the brown commons gestures as it reaches for the possibility that something else awaits us. This gesture is a kind of touching, an intimate being together, a way of seeing what might flow between us. It is the we in this commons. It is our commonality. It is itself a rhetorical gesture of future possibilities, an invitation to sit together in the emotion-laden spaces of meaning, making, and mystery, as stated by Rodriguez. While much of the invitational gestures and ephemeral sentiment of having a space where one can belong is communicated verbally and transactionally, it is also a gesture that is voiced in the constituting of the very brown commons themselves, given that it is a space for commonality, a place to engage in the commonness of a culture, and even if that culture is non-normative. There, through reading, being, and dwelling in this space of Me Too and Remezcla, we are touched, and tiny corporal gestures of recognition ripple through our nerves. We become charged with vitality. This is about a connection and communion that binds us to friends and strangers. It is a tangled enactment of psychic encounters that promise ecstasy and objection, Rodriguez. Together, these commons or homes are brown commons, gesture and signal an action that extends beyond itself, that reaches, suggests, and motions, and that suggests another then and there. By pulling and deconstructing some of the space of Remezcla and Me Too, two brown commons full of intimacy and chusmera, we see the conditions of oppression and experience, third spaces of remix, and also a space for belonging. As pushed and pulled by structures and matrices of power, subjects are placed as peripheral, exterior, or othered. Any cultural fragment, whether historical, of the past, or contemporary, carries with it, as it is contoured and given interior meaning by its varying culture. Culture creates the conditions of, within, and against intelligibility. Yet, functioning in and operating in a third space, Remezcla and Me Too actively engage against, within, and beyond. Thus, although this analytic centers on the cultural digital spaces of Remezcla and Me Too as a cultural slice of intelligibility, the logos of Latinx resistance and ultimately Animo y Luz is what matters and not terror. It's this revitalization that Rodriguez talks about that matters when we are in commonality in these spaces of shared affective feeling. The heart of this analysis began on the note of darkness and terror, yet it is exactly because of these very conditions of impossibility of life and luz that this work has trekked to find the interstitial space, the third option. And in doing so, light and luz is found in the brown commons, the invisible communicative gesturing, the metaphysical revitalization, the touching, the being in commons together, creates a radical possibility and intelligibility on how and what it means to survive and have luz en lo oscuro. Conclusion. As the affective and material shared focal point of structured embodied suffering and suffocation, the nexus where one fights to live and to breathe, collective rage is the painfully crucially spatiality of emotion that binds and gives rise to an understanding of what it means to dare to bear life and embody luz. It is within this shared spatiality of emotional pain and darkness in lo oscuro that rage and dissonance grows and cycles vive y grita as it becomes the impetus for the oppressed and subaltern's very own animo, animation, and space, our will to life. To end, the concept of animo is invoked from its etymological Latin root to bring to life and to bear a metaphysical energy of lightness. Further, animo is understood as to animate, to give someone in a metaphysical dimension life and luz, or to revitalize, as suggested by Rodriguez. This is why it is in the very shared spatiality of rage and anguish and impossibility that we say, amigo, animo. As we, a counter-public of resistance, are brought into the spatiality of pain, it is in our coming together, our act of reassembling of a third way that we bear and recycle life once again. With animo and luz, we bear life again. Gracias.
Thank you. Those are excellent papers, all three. Do we have questions or comments from the audience? And if you do, then I'll do the Oprah thing and bring the thing, the mic. Back there. Aye, boy. Sure, here you are.
This question is for Rebecca. Thank you very much for that piece. That was really nice to listen to. I was just curious, I know that you don't claim to do this in your work, so if it's hard to answer to in this moment, I'm not sure, but based on the trajectory of like Munoz and Futurity and like this creation of third space and survival, I was wondering if you could maybe speak more to the relationship between survival and then ultimately like resistance, I guess, or the relationship between like survival, like at the end you were referencing the recycling of life and moving forward. So the relationship between disidentification, survival, but then also like ultimately like transgression and I guess resistance on a structural level.
Yeah.
But if not, like I know that you didn't like, but yeah.
As you can tell by my laugh, that is like a great question. And I've certainly thought about the structural, post-structuralist tension between much resistant and transgressive work. And certainly my small, humble project is not going to resolve that huge gap that has persisted in the academy for like decades and decades. But I can give you my personal response to how I'm approaching that very super important question that our lives depend on, that my life depends on. My dissertation work is not on counterpublics. My dissertation work is on the rhetoric of Donald J. Trump. And I am continuously looped in seeing his face, hearing his voice, looking at his lips move. I am a discourse analyst. I am a rhetorical critic by training. I've been doing this for 10 years, so I know what I should be doing, really. I know what I should be looking at, but I refuse to look at him as a queer woman of color, first-gen student person, like doing everything the first time myself, right? So it is incredibly difficult to look at him and continue doing my dissertation work. On top of, doing your dissertation is just really difficult. And so when this opportunity arose to present in this conference, which is itself representative and constitutive of a counter-public, which is about third space, which is about resistance, but resistance with a self-preservation, self-care tenor and motif, I of course said, hell fucking yes, I want to apply to this conference, to be with community, to learn from others, not necessarily so that I can walk through a project that makes me think about counterpublics, but to be with a counterpublic where I don't have to explain myself, where I don't have to engage with the shit that this president says, with that terrorism. And so that's how I would answer your question, is that my dominant work, whatever the hell that means, to get my PhD, I am working on Donald J. Trump, and I am not looking at counterpublics. But there is no way that I could just do that work alone and not die slowly inside. I need counterpublics at the same time in my life, in some way, in projects, being amongst others, in community, in a Brown Commons, so that I can have this shared feeling and this humanness that I only get when I'm in community with you. And so that's how I would answer your question, is I can't imagine them divorced. I just cannot. Thank you for that question. It was so brilliant. I hope that I did justice to it, because it was a super cool question.
Any other questions? Comments? Don't be shy. Come on, folks. Yes, this gentleman.
Hi. So this question is going to be for Tyler. So in your presentation, there seemed to be a lot of derision of these Instagram influencers for showing their bodies, and that was an act of reinforcing the sort of mimetic desires of what we are supposed to desire. And a lot of the blame in your presentation seemed to fall on the influencers themselves, and there was, to me, an implied call for regulation of bodily performance from those people, and I could be interpreting that wrong, and I totally am open to that. But I'm just wondering, also, as a person who's been partial hospitalization programs for eating disorders, who've come from like a similar place, how an increased regulation of bodies doesn't reaffirm aesthetic bodily normativity when we're making these calls of don't show your torso because it presents an image that we find too perfect. It seems to be reaffirming to me the ideals of aesthetic bodily normativity.
This is why I hate 20-minute presentations. So short answer is that you are kind of wrong, because that's not where I lay the blame. But, and y'all are welcome to look at my Instagram. I'm naked as fuck on my Instagram. Like, go look at it. But the point I'm making is that the culture that I belong to, which is the hegemonic gay culture, has one type of body that is deemed as acceptable, right? And through the repeated gesturing of this body, I don't think them taking their clothes off is the problem. The problem is them taking their clothes off and then desiring other people that look exactly like them, and portraying this sort of white, body normative, heteronormative way of kind of like imagining the possibilities of gay sexuality and homoeroticism in your own life. And a quick anecdote, my friend who actually was supposed to help me give this presentation didn't come, is an Instagram influencer. I didn't include him in the project because I didn't have time, but he and his partner recently broke up and actually made like national LGBT news. It was a really big deal. And my friend is a little femme of center, smaller, slighter than his partner, i.e. coded as the bottom. when they broke up. And I can tell you, like, it was a very mutual decision. There was no one at fault. No one cheated on each other. There was no sort of issue that, besides the fact they didn't want to be together anymore. My friend received hundreds of negative messages, hate mail, comments on old pictures of them going back years and years and years, blaming him for the breakup, and comments like, "Wow, you had a real man and you gave that up." The culture is what needs to change. Now, how we go about doing that, I don't know. I have ideas for my other research. If anything, I think maybe the answer would be to not regulate what people post on Instagram, but just abolish Instagram.
Do you have a comment, question? Anyone? Yes. I am.
Hola, this is for Israel. Yeah, so I was really interested in coming to the session because of your presentation. I mean, all of them are really cool, but I was really invested in yours. So I know online with curanderismo, lots of folks there's this kind of tension of putting stuff online because it's something very intimate and something very traditional that's passed down, either orally or just like within family boundaries. So I don't know if you came across that in your research or in your work, and how folks are having discussions around that, and how I know some folks like do workshops online and like share that and are very intentional. Like I follow La Loba Loca, and so Loba is really intentional about who gets to access the information that Loba puts out. So I don't know, I guess just like speaking to that and how that kind of goes back to the LaCroix thing and the connection between that.
I had a lot of time because I worked overnight, and so it gives you, like, there's no one in the store, like, there are 2 employees, so I had a lot of time to think. Whether that was generative or not, I leave to you, but, so there's a little bit, like, so one part, I didn't see a whole lot of that gatekeeping that you mentioned, which is good because I would push back on that. One, because gatekeeping doesn't do a whole lot of good, generally speaking. Look at the academy. But 2, so many prominent curanderos didn't have a sort of hereditary lineage, right? Like Don Pedro Jaramillo, like he had an accident one day, and he woke up and he heard the voice of God telling him, "You have a gift to heal. This is how you go do things." So I feel like people who push back in that way about that are sort of constricting this thing, which at the end of the day, whether you believe in God or not, it's thought that God gave you this gift to go help people, right? So why are you going to put limitations on this thing? Because then that's just sort of doing the work of the colonizer, right? So there's that, but sort of the controversial stuff that I did see that kind of made me cringe was stuff that would be less traditional, and by traditional, I mean stuff that you don't really see a lot on the Texas-Mexico border, like herbs that aren't from the area, or things that are very specifically Wiccan, or stuff like #Mexican voodoo. What even is that? And I asked them several times because they use that hashtag consistently, and I never get a reply. So I didn't see a whole lot of that, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was really just asking because thank you. I was asking because I think there's this fear of the commodification of this, again, really intimate teachings and learnings.
Yeah.
So it's really, whenever I come across this, I wonder how people go about sharing the information and the practices.
Yeah, for sure. And so I imagine that's very sensitive to people who have this sort of lineage in their families. But again, I would push back that that's just one way of approaching it, right? So like, don't police the way that other people approach it necessarily, just because that sort of undoes the decolonizing potential, I think.
For sure. Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Anyone? Yes.
Okay, for Tyler, you were talking about how anorexia runs like higher inside of the gay community than like straight men, and as like a past experience knowing like eating disorders and all that, so for girls I know it's like really strong, like when it comes to like internet and their like body images is like basically the same within gay males and girls, like is like a same type of like pressure to be one type of way. It's just like all like that. Okay, I just wanted to know.
Yeah, but what I think is interesting and what Gerard proposes is different about anorexia is there's this idea that you become an anorexic because you see someone and you want to look like them. And I think most of us know, like, we're not going to ever look like anybody but us unless you have a shit ton of money and like Jane Fonda's surgeon, right? Like, 'cause you got to have a really, really good surgeon, right? So instead, where does anorexia come from? And it comes from wanting the objects that other people have. And for gay men, the mechanism that I've noticed is that growing up in a heteronormative environment where the very possibility of a Friday night fuck, let alone a relationship, is so impossible to you that you have to imitate the closest thing you can see. It just so happens, though, that what you are imitating in order to get the object that you want, which is sex, is entirely a fiction. And to desire to look like the bodies that most of these Instagram influencers, and I'll tell you, like, watching them Facetune is one of the most horrifying things I've ever seen, because you take a body, like a male body is not shaped like this ever, right? No one's body goes like that, but they take their hips, they tuck in their hips, they pull out their shoulders, they pull out their biceps, they pull out their triceps, and they're like, oh, well, I'm at it, I might as well do my face. They make their eyes bigger, they fortify their jawline, and before you know it, some teenager in Ohio looks at that and goes, oh, I have to look like that if I ever want a boyfriend. And that's where anorexia starts. That's where it started for me. I just woke up one day, was 14, and was like, oh, I don't look like that. Didn't realize that nobody looks like that, actually. And like had a very severe case of anorexia until I was 18. And it comes back in bouts and waves, right? And I think understanding anorexia that way is important, because now we understand that the issue isn't just like media effects, and there's so much research on media effects, but also the fact that people need homoerotic icons. We need to have young people exposed to gay sex. It's like probably controversial elsewhere, but yeah, you need to have some realistic idea of how to get laid so that you can get laid in a healthy way, that it doesn't end up with you damaging your body.
I'd like to speak to that just briefly, because I've been experiencing that with my daughter, who's 12 now, and began her bout of anorexia at the age of 11. And it was really intriguing to me to be at the eating disorder unit, because she was in the, it's been a year now that she was in there for 7 weeks. And, you know, the mythology about anorexia is that it's teenage white middle-class girls, right? And my daughter was only 11, and there were girls there as young as 8, and there were tween boys who very clearly, my co-parent and I, we were the only lesbians in the group, and my co-parent and I discussed the fact that isn't it interesting that the young boys who were tweens seemed so incredibly queer, and their parents were like far-right traditionalists, Trump supporters, and Christian right. And you could see the frustration for these young boys. And you know, they were all classes, all races, so all of those dictates that we know socially are just not the case. And I wanted to start doing an ethnographic study, but I was so busy learning about what it meant for my daughter as an 11-year-old. And I think it's different for each of them, right? I mean, what you're saying going on for gay men was very different with what goes on for tween girls. And she and I have been discussing it now for a year, and we've been in therapy about it. But yeah, it's incredibly serious, and we never want to talk about what it means and what it means for sexuality. Yeah. So thank you for that.
I was going to say, to add on to that, why do you feel that it's more highly in the gay community than just like straight men? So why do you think like the risk of anorexia is more highly?
I mean, heteronormativity, right? Heteronormativity is so evil in the way that it just kind of very quietly and innocuously makes you feel like what you want is impossible. And when you get the first taste of what it is, and there's a ton of studies on this with porn too, right? And that's why you have an epidemic of gay men with like bareback sex and other unhealthy sexual practices, because they begin to associate, I want sex. They don't want that guy in the video. They don't necessarily want the influencer. They just want to get laid, right? And like, because it's so impossible to even imagine what that looks like, it ends up creating a lot of harmful practices, because your first exposure to it is usually something that's like not very representative. And if it is representative of reality, there's gonna be some other problem with it.
Thank you. My question is for Rebecca. I was wondering, you talk in the beginning of your piece about terrorism, and like you really speak about it in the way that it's not commonly talked about. I was wondering if you could go into your process of how you made that decision to,
Sure.
like, yes,
Sure.
cool.
Yeah, that's a question that I'm still tackling in my dissertation and the starting grounds of my dissertation. And like most advancements in resistance theory or transgressive literature, we find, not just myself, but we find these advancements or innovative or old patterns that reemerge by observing or by being in place. So it wasn't that I was reading about it, not at all. It was that I was feeling it in my very queer, brown body. I'm still completing my PhD, but I completed my 4 years of coursework at CU Boulder, a primarily white institution. Enough said. And so a large reason why I had to move to East LA to complete my dissertation is because I could not stand the maggots, the Trumpers that would place their hats on their damn heads and like would walk around intimidating students of color. And I purposely ordered my LA Dodgers hat, and I would wear that damn blue hat as much as I could. But at a certain point, I felt the terrorism on my body. And it was time for me to then come home to Southeast LA and finish my dissertation. And that is exactly where I started, on terrorism within from this administration. And this country likes to think of itself as so many wonderful, beautiful things stated philosophically in the Constitution, right? But post 9/11, terrorism is within. It is not moving out. It's not the caravans. It's not the Middle Eastern people inside the caravan that are coming over. All of these wild stories, it's not that. It is within. It is happening from top down, not from down up. And so I realized this, as I'm sure many other bodies who are positioned like mine are realizing this, through just the experience, through living through it. I think we think that resistance, or at least in the academy and in elite spaces, we think that resistance comes, or at least the innovations of resistant theory, that it somehow comes through reading tons of books. No, it does not. It comes through the subjects who are experiencing it and can see from a unique and special phenomenological standpoint the realities of the world and the nuanced rematricings that are happening. And so that's how I was able to come to that realization. And I mean terror as an anxiety in my body, right? Like a very literal anxiety that was difficult to name and to grab it because it wasn't me, it was us. hence the structure of feeling, the brown feeling that Munoz talks about. So I'm still piecing a lot of that together in my much larger project. But thank you for seeing value, because I totally need the validation. But thank you.
Time perhaps for one more question or comment? Anyone? Okay.
Thank you. This is for Israel. I got super excited at the end. You mentioned crip theory. And I was wondering if, like, how you saw crip theory or maybe even disability studies speaking to curanderismo. And if, like, if you think it's cripping the medical industrial complex. Like, I'm just curious to know, like, the conversation that maybe it's having with disability studies and, yeah, medical industrial stuff.
So it's conversation of one, me talking to myself. So I'm aiming to do my dissertation work on curanderismo and its implications for decolonizing. And so I break it down by gender and race, and I'm starting to get into disability studies too now. Because for so long I was interested in the stories of the healers, but then one day I was like, what about the people who go to the healers? We wouldn't have any of these stories or instances without any of them to begin with. So all that's to say is that I'm still very, very new, and I thought that this conference paper would be a good sort of pivot in that direction. But there's not a lot in religious studies, which is my field. There's stuff like disability theory in the Bible, which is great, but that's very much not what I do. I mean, I could, because they get all the money. But I'm still looking for that conversation, right? Yeah.
I had one final comment, if that's okay. All the papers were really wonderful, and I think what I enjoyed is the way in which you all brought together or fused digital gestures. But also what I found is the digital, is not gesture, but the gestures of intimacy in each of your papers, and the way that you're reworking Rodriguez's work on gestures of intimacy. So I just wanted to make that comment as we closed off. And thank you again, all of you, and let's give them a last round of applause.
Thank you to all of you.